Let Brother Chris get our audio visual. Okay, we ready? Good. Good morning. So glad to see all of you this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your love for God's Word and studying together. I hope it's a blessing. Revelation chapter 12 this morning. So we are chapter-wise halfway through the book. A little more considering our introductory lessons, but about halfway through the book, and we're going to just a reminder to think about the idea that we've kind of framed. We've framed the book a little bit kind of around these 7 cycles: the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of plague, and while I think that's true, that's a good way to look at it, it's probably important to bear in mind that the real, those who are blessed by reading the book, the cycles represent judgments. They represent trial and tribulation and trouble on the enemies of God, whether they're the Jews or whether they're the Roman armies or other enemies. This represents the judgments on them, but who are those who are blessed in the book of Revelation? Who are those who are blessed by the book? The saints, the people of God. The people of God. It's about, we're going to talk about this morning, war, the idea of war in heaven. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. But it's really important for us to understand it's written to saints who are in a war, saints who are in the middle of a war. And it's for their blessing. It's to pull them through. I hate to go back on Chris's lesson, but it's so they have endurance. So they endure what they're about to face and endure it in faithfulness to God. Let's begin with a prayer if we could. Holy Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for your wisdom and provision for us through your Son, Jesus Christ, and the story of that as we have it in your word. Help us as we try to navigate through things that might be difficult for us to understand. Help us to keep in mind the Lamb and his battle and his overcoming and his victory, which is our victory. We pray in his name. Amen. So quickly, I messed up last week on 2 things, and I need to touch on them before we go on, because one of them I forgot, and the other one I said it in a sloppy way, I think. So let me just mention this. Chapter 11, measure the temple. We did touch on measuring the temple there in the beginning of chapter 11. And I think we talked about the importance of it, but I failed to kind of connect it back to chapter 7 and verse 2, where the people of God who were going to have to go through the trial and tribulation were sealed. They're sealed by God, sealed by the angel to protect them as they go through. And I think maybe the same idea is here in chapter 11 and verse 1. Measure the temple and the altar and those who worship there. And then it goes on to talk about the 2 witnesses, of course. And I think the idea is measure for protection. What's about to happen to the people of God as they go through this, he's saying, it's okay. I know you. I know who you are, and I'll bring you through this. So I think I failed to say that last week, and I want to do that quickly. The other was about the 2 witnesses. I said something, kind of glossed over it, like most of our brethren who've written commentaries think the 2 witnesses at the church. And there's some truth to that, but Chris pointed out to me something he had been reading, and it actually reminded me that several of these commentators had different ways of expressing this. So I just wanted to correct that, make sure I didn't mislead you on it. Some of them at the bottom, for example, the apostles, think the two witnesses are the apostles and prophets. Brother Haley, the Holy Spirit and the apostles with the testimony of the saints. Harkrider, the total evangelist who went out preaching the gospel. I had kind of lumped these together in my mind with the idea of the New Testament church and their, those who were their leaders, those were their teachers and so forth. But I just wanted to be sure I corrected that before we go on in chapter 12. Anybody want to make a comment about that? Okay, let's think about chapter 12 then. A great sign appeared in heaven. Remember, we're in that interval between the trumpets and the bowls, and we've got several chapters here that are written with purpose. And maybe it'd be better to say, instead of the 7 cycles or the framework, maybe these pauses to instruct and encourage the saints. Maybe that's the real framework. So I don't want to minimize them at all because it's really important. A great sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So think about when we were in chapter 11, we were coming to the end. It mentions the sounding of the 7th trumpet, and it mentions lightning coming from the throne. It mentions John seeing the ark, the temple, and the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. So it kind of gives you the idea that here's something momentous that's coming, and it's almost like the pause in chapter 8 right at the beginning. It kind of marks, pay attention to this. And then John sees a sign in heaven, this woman who is arrayed with what? She's clothed with the sun. The moon is her footstool. The stars are her crown. So what does that sound like? Remember, it's a sign. It's not a literal woman. It's a sign that John is seeing. What could it stand for?
Obviously, she's bright. She has a lot of light.
Yeah. Brother Ricky, do you? Yeah, she is shining with the glory of the sun. By the way, we mentioned this before, but just bear it in mind, and I'm not sure if this is the right way to read this, but heaven means at least 3 different things in the Bible. Sometimes the sky where the birds fly. Sometimes it's where the moon and stars are. It's the constellations, the sun, moon, and stars. Sometimes it's the heavenly throne area, where God's throne is. Maybe there are other ways it's used. But it could be that right here John is seeing in the heavens, the sun, moon, and stars is spread across the heaven. He's just seeing a sign about a woman. And the woman obviously is going to give birth to a child. And there in just a few verses, what do we have a picture of? Jesus Christ, the birth of Christ. I mean, it's like he's going back to say, look what's behind all of this. Okay, there's a woman that brings a son into the world. There's a dragon waiting to eat him up as soon as he's born. He's caught up to heaven. Of course, he leaves out all kinds of details about the birth and the life and the death of Christ, but he's trying to snapshot this to say, look what God is doing in redemption. Look what God is doing in the history. Look what's behind the war in Jerusalem or in Turkey, in Asia or wherever it is. Look what's really going on behind the scenes. Look what went before that. So he has this picture that John is supposed to see, and he's supposed to think of something. The saints who read about this are supposed to think of something. That in God's grand scheme of things, he brings this son into the world, and the devil is against him, and the dragon wants to eat him up, but he's snatched up to heaven. It's just a thumbnail of what God is doing in redemption, and that all these things they're seeing in the world and they're about to go through, there's something behind it that has to do with God's redeeming his church, redeeming mankind. This is a passage, so who is the woman? And I don't know that we need to settle this. There are a lot of ideas. Some people say, oh, that's Mary because she gives birth to Jesus, or it's Eve because she gives birth to the whole world. I don't know for sure, but who brings the Christ into the world? Who prepares the way for the Christ to come? Israel. Israel, Jesus comes into the world through Israel. So a lot of people think that the mother, the woman here in this vision is Israel, or the faithful remnant of Israel. They're bringing the Christ into the world. Isaiah 66 just speaks about, I think this has to do with restoration from the Babylonian captivity in its primary context, but it just speaks about Zion, the people of God as Zion bringing forth redemption, bringing forth the release from captivity, the victory over the Babylonians. We won't go back and study the detail. I just put it up here to help us think about this idea that it's not necessarily talking about he saw Mary up in the heaven. It's talking about God's work in the world, and he's bringing this child in. Ashley.
Could it also be like a symbolism of authority and power? Because the sun and the moon and the stars are so powerful, and we see that they're brought into submission by being clothed and under her feet and a crown. So if you parallel that with God's power, he's going to be
Yes.
all authoritative and bring him.
That's a great point. Even if it were Israel, it's Israel by God's power. And often stars, constellations, in Revelation even, often it means power. It means authority. The dragon here in chapter 12, the dragon takes a third of the stars and wipes them out. It's kind of knocking down authorities.
So, I want to correct my wife brought it up. It was interesting. Think about Joseph's dream. The
Yes.
sun and the moon and the stars bowed down. You talk about authority.
Yeah, that's a great point. Chris mentioning Joseph's dream where the sun, moon, and the stars bow down. And I did see someone allude to that in this passage, and that's a good one to think about. So I don't know if there's an exact parallel, but it does fit with that idea that here were what represented the authorities of the heavens, or what represented authority before God, and God owns that. He uses that. He shapes it to bring this child into the world, to bring this baby into the world. And again, this is not for us to pick every little exact parallel. It's to get a picture of what John is going to see about this war that's going to happen, and to get a picture that this is God's working. So these are things, obviously, that had already happened. The death of the coming of Christ and his death and resurrection had already happened. But he's putting it in context. He's showing what God is doing in the world.
That child, Larry,
Yes.
that child will be the ruler of many nations.
Yes. We're coming to that. I think he'll rule the nations with a rod of iron. Verse 5, she gave birth to a male child who will rule, or some versions say shepherd the nations with a rod of iron, and the child is caught up to God in the throne. The dragon is introduced here. We're going to learn a lot more about the dragon as this chapter goes on, and then later on as well in the book of Revelation. Here in this chapter, it tells us that he's the devil, the Satan, the deceiver, the accuser. We'll come to that in just a minute. Why does he have 7 heads and 10 horns? We haven't quite seen that yet in Revelation, but does it ring a bell with any of you?
Yeah, we have studied the symbolism of 7.
Yes, 7 is often the symbol. If you
Horns aren't horns symbols of power.
horns are symbols of power. 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns on the heads. Actually, this is somewhat similar to Daniel's vision. Daniel chapter 7, we won't go back and look at that. But we'll save what all that stands for till chapter 17, because it may be in the next chapter. But anyway, we'll get more detail about this and talk more about this. Remember, this is a broad picture, the sign that John sees in the heaven of maybe you might say what the backstory is. What's the backstory line of what's going on here?
Worldly power, maybe?
Pardon?
Worldly power, maybe?
Yeah, worldly power. I think that's basically what it.
Power than God.
Thinks that what it amounts to, because we'll see the beast, who is the Roman Empire, described that way. Amen.
And I think that one of the main points is he's formidable.
He is formidable. He has power. We're going to see a lot more about this. He has power, but God is channeling this. God is controlling this. God is allowing what he wants to allow. But this is a fearsome picture. It was something that they were going to see fearsome things. They were going to see horrible things. Some of them might die, remember from chapter 2.
The first time that this serpent, this image of the devil, is the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
Yep. That's a great study, actually, to go through and think about serpent and how it's used. Remember in the 5th and 6th trumpets, you had the 6th trumpet, the horses with their tails were like serpents, and the scorpions, their tails, the locusts, their tails were like scorpions. Maybe some symbolism there, but just to make sure we get to the heart of this chapter, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Just think about this idea, though, that he is picturing this dragon with the power that he has and with the authority that he has and with the intent to do harm to God's child, to the child of the woman, and then as we go on in the chapter, to the seed of the woman, to the offspring. So look at the end of this. The child is caught up to God and his throne, and to his throne, and the woman flees into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God, which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Forget 1,260 just a minute. She flees in the wilderness to be nourished. What does that conjure up?
God took care of his people in the wilderness.
To them, it would have brought up the Old Testament wilderness. God took care of them through the wilderness wandering. He provided for them. He got them through to the promised land, right? And so he's bringing this vision, this sign that John's seeing, is weaving in these ideas about God being in control, and it's expressing them in terms that would have been familiar to them. By the way, some people believe, and there's historical evidence about it, that during the siege of Jerusalem, the war that was leading up to the siege of Jerusalem, that many Christians fled. As Jesus had told them, when you see these signs, get out of Judea and go to flee to the mountains, Matthew 24. And many Christians did during that time. And so that could be, I'm not necessarily tying it to this, but this could be an allusion to that.
I was going to say that one of the things I read, and then I went back and looked, I have a copy of Josephus, and it actually tells that
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of history about that, that if this relates to that time where the faithful who were listening to what Jesus and the apostles said, when they saw Jerusalem, the armies encroaching, they left the area because Jesus said, get out of there.
Yeah, and we lived it further, like in the Old Testament, we were talking about the fleeing into the wilderness from Egypt, right? The Exodus
Yes.
and all things.
Yes,
Exodus 19:4 says she was born upon eagle's wings.
yes.
So he's
Yeah.
that whole symbolism there.
I forgot that, but that's a great point, and this is mentioned again in this chapter as well. God bearing Israel on eagle's wings. Of course, he didn't literally do that, but it was a picture of what he did to bring them through. Okay, verse 7. Now war arose in heaven. So I asked Chris, and he didn't know. I'm teasing about that. We were just both puzzling a little bit about it, talking about it. War in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. Let's think about that for just a minute. Some people, when they see that, they have a picture of the throne scene from chapter 4 and 5, and there was war going on up there. But I think this is really not what the idea is. I think he's thinking about, when he says war in heaven, he's talking about war in the spiritual realm. War that's going on in the earth, but it has spiritual ramifications. It has spiritual backing behind it. God has an interest in this. God has not only an interest, but God has an authority over it, a control over it, of what's going to happen. So when we think about the idea of war in heaven, I think it's an expression that's telling us that this fighting that's going on, these judgments that they're going to go through, it's not just detached from the things of God. This is God's people involved in this, and this means God is involved in it. It means he has an interest in it, and he has an interest to control it, if we could say it in that way. Control it. He has an interest to bring this about, and when his people are in trouble, he has an interest to protect them and a promise that he will protect them, and he fights for them. Now, how does he do that? I don't know all the ways. He has unlimited ways, actually, that he can do that. But one way it's depicted here is that Michael and his angels fight against the dragon and his angels. What is that? Why that expression there? Where do we know Michael from otherwise? Daniel, book of Daniel. He's mentioned in Jude, which I don't think we'll tackle that verse today, but drawing from Daniel, in the prophecies of Daniel, Michael is, he's an angel who is helping the people of God in their battles. Maybe not only the people of God, he's helping the prince of Persia, helping the prince of Greece against the prince of Persia. I may be getting my princes mixed up, but in Daniel 10 and 12, Michael he's working in the world. He's working for God to help God in his causes and his what he's trying to unfold. And so in this case, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels, what could that mean? See if I can.
God is there for us. His army, his people are there for us
Yeah.
to help us. I know I was reading that this morning. I was thinking, when we think about Christ on the cross, he had that available to him if he had gotten tired of it.
Yeah.
And yet he chose to stay there.
He could have called 10,000 angels, we sing sometimes. And, I don't know all that I see about angels. I don't understand all of it, can't explain all of it. But we shouldn't deny that they exist. And God can work in ways that we can't fathom. This reference in Daniel 12, which I think is talking about this same time period, but look what it says. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there will be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Jesus used this language, time of trouble such as never has been. Jesus used that language exactly when he's talking to his disciples about what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Now that doesn't prove that it's the same, talking about the exact same event, but it ought to help us think about it this way. And I see it that way here in Revelation, that he's speaking about things that are going to go on in the world that you can be sure God knows what's going on, and he brings about what he wills in this, and he has ways of doing it. He doesn't need an army. He can summon an army if he wants to, but he doesn't need one. In Revelation 19, when Jesus comes on a white horse and he's got this big army behind him, and he's coming to tackle the beast and the false prophet, to take them on. He's got this huge army behind him, but he doesn't use it. The army doesn't do anything. They just go behind, and he takes care of them. But they follow him. They're faithful to him. But I mean, he doesn't rely on a military army to go and fight that battle for him. He comes, and he comes in judgment. And that may be kind of the idea here, that God has these hosts. The devil has his host. The dragon has his host. But God has his host that do his work in the world. And what's the upshot of this? This is a snapshot now. What's the upshot of it? What's the outcome?
He wins, we win.
Yeah, the dragon is defeated. The dragon is cast out. Again, thinking about this in a spiritual sense, the dragon, his power is emptied. You know, he's cast down to the earth. Not that he can't do anything, but he can't win over God's people and God's forces. How?
I'm just saying, one of the things I read about, up until this time, up until the time that Christ came, he had power over men's souls. And then when Christ came, his sacrifice was brought before God.
Yes.
That sacrifice freed us from that binding.
Yes. And Brother Bob, no. Was it Brother Bob that talked about that when he was here? Or Jim? I can't remember. One of them talked about that idea, and we're going to touch on some of that in just a minute. Just quickly, the dragon's identity. He tells us here that he's the devil, Satan. The devil in Greek, that word really means accuser or slanderer, someone who would speak against the people of God. And how often the devil is spoken of that way, as an accuser. Satan means adversary. Howard?
Keep interrupting, but
That's all right.
as I was thinking about that, I went back and looked at Job. You remember?
Yeah.
Satan before God accuses Job of just doing this because of his protection.
Yeah. Yeah, so in those first two chapters in Job, he comes and he says, oh, he's only following you for the good stuff you give him, you know. He's an accuser. And this is what Satan does. This is what Satan does. He accuses people of rebellion against God, whether it's true or not. Zechariah 3 is an interesting, we won't read that whole passage, but interesting little story. It's a picture, Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord goes on and rebukes Satan, says, Joshua's my man. He's sitting there in the dirty garments and he looks like he's not much, but he's my man. And then he cleans Joshua up. So the idea of an accuser, that's Satan's job, that's his role. Deceiver of the whole world, it says. This is how Satan does his work. He deceives. This is the only way he can really do anything, especially since Jesus, has defeated him. The only way he can get to us is to deceive us. And how good he is at that, right? How good he is at that. He can make a lot of things look really good to us. So when was Satan defeated? I think this is what you were asking about. How there's a lot of things we could talk about here, but just let's think about a couple of passages from Jesus himself. Luke 10:18, after the 70 come back and they say, even the demons are subject to us. And Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And there were some people who take this verse as telling how Satan originated. I'm not sure that's what this is. I think he's saying, I came to defeat him and he's going to be defeated. And I see it. I see that it's going to happen. And that's kind of upheld by some of the other things he says. What about when he's casting out demons in Luke 11? I didn't put that quote on here, but he says, I enter the strong man's house. I'm paraphrasing. I enter the strong man's house and I bind him. So I have power over him. When he's casting out demons, I'm demonstrating, he says, I have power over Satan to bind him, to bind the strong man. John 12, just as Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And he had a couple of other expressions like that as he goes to the cross. So in his death and his resurrection, he's defeating, he's casting Satan out. So I think in chapter 12, this may be just a picture of that very thing. It's a sign that talks about the defeat of Satan. That in this grand scheme of things, God planned for redemption. He brings the Christ into the world. He protects him from Satan. He snatches him up to heaven. He protects the woman. He in that process, he casts Satan down, limits his power, binds him in chapter 20, binds him for 1,000 years. What about this verse we studied in Hebrews? Through death, he might destroy the one who has the power of death. So Satan is cast out by the death and the resurrection of Christ. Okay. After that sign, the woman, the dragon, the war, then I heard a loud voice, salvation, strength, and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Who's they? Christ is overcoming the blood of the Lamb. They're overcoming by the blood of the Lamb. But who's overcoming? The saints, the brethren, the accuser of our brethren. The brethren are overcoming by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. By the blood of the Lamb. By the death of Christ. By the sacrifice of Christ, as we've been studying in Hebrews. By the word of their testimony. What would that mean? Jesus' sacrifice defeats Satan, casts him down. But what does it mean for us? What does it mean for God's people? Stay faithful to it. confess it, believe in it, uphold it. Let your witness be. I'm part of that. I belong to him. Pat?
I think also when it says their testimony for the first century Christians then, it's not like they have Bibles they were passing around, but it's written.
Yep.
They're dependent on this eyewitness testimony.
Great.
And that's what would have helped them to persevere. That would have been a great encouragement to them as it is to us with the written word.
Yeah. Great point. Especially important in the first century where they didn't have a New Testament to especially carry around in their pocket or on their phones, right? They didn't have that. But the word that was spoken, the word of Christ relayed through the apostles and prophets, and the words that the saints would speak to one another in testimony and witness of what had been going on. You know, we do this when we come together and we try to encourage one another. The word of our testimony, we're strengthening it. We're using it on one another. We're building one another up in that way. And he says, this is how we overcome in the war. This is how we overcome. One lesson I did on this back when I was in Oxford, I titled this lesson, "What Did You Do in the War, Daddy?" Some of y'all may be too young to know this, but in my day, you know, in my younger days, what did you do in the war? And we're talking about World War II. What did you do in the war? You know, because all the men, just about all the men had gone, some of the women too, but just about all the men had gone to the war and the women had gone to work. And so what did you do in the war? Well, this is a good question for Christians. What did we do in the war? And I really love, by the way, so much that goes on here that people working toward that end. It's really an encouragement. You sisters, young and experienced sisters too. It's really encouraging to see the things that y'all try to do for one another. It's part of the war. You know, it's what we got to endure in, right, Chris? And in the Greek it says three things. And they loved not their lives even to the death. How did they overcome? By the blood of the Lamb, first and foremost, by their faithfulness. And they didn't give up. No matter what came, they were holding on. This is how they overcame in this grand scheme in chapter 12 that he's giving about redemption. What does it mean to them? It means, to them, it means how do we overcome? How do we make it through? And when the dragon saw he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman's given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she's to be nourished for time and times and half a time. 3.5 times, time and half a times, 3.5 times, 42 months, 1,260 days. All these kind of refer to a similar idea in Revelation. I don't know about in every instance, but often it refers to a similar idea, which is 3.5 is what? It's a half a 7. It's a broken 7, you might say. 7 is perfection. 3.5 is not so much. You know, it's a temporary time. It's a limited time. Maybe in some cases not even a time. It's a state of things that falls short of eternity, or falls short of perfection, or falls short of completion. There's a time that the woman is sheltered during the tribulation. Some people think this is talking about that siege of Jerusalem again. It could be. There's some literal historical things that could fit with that. But conceptually, It's for us too. It's in every age of tribulation. In every time of tribulation, the war that goes on between evil empire and godliness and righteousness. And we'll see this more in chapter 13 and as we go further. The serpent pours water out like a river out of his mouth to sweep her away with the flood, but the earth helps the woman and swallows up the water that the dragon spews out. So what could that be? Pardon? Yeah, God's help. God can use, again, we're stretching here. We're trying to imagine application of this. But God can use the earth to help his people. God can use angels to help his people. God can use wicked people to help his people.
Makes me think back the Old Testament, I don't know exactly where it's at now, I just thought of it, but, he has his stores of lightning bolts and hail and all the things that he can use. But there's so much that he can use.
Yes, yes. So all of it, remember, is under the control of that spiritual realm. It's under the, I used to think about it as the, well, here you've got the earthly realm over here, or the material world, and then you've got over here, you've got the spiritual. But really, I think we should look at it as there's this spiritual realm that God is in, that he controls, and the material realm is confined somehow. It's subsumed somehow within that. It's greater than the spiritual realm is greater than the material realm. It upholds the material realm. It controls the material realm. And so, I forgot where I was going with that point, but it was a good one though. So, verse 17. The dragon became furious with the woman. God's protecting the woman. The dragon is furious about that. So he goes off to make war with the rest of her offspring and those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. What could that be? I think it might be, we could look at it two ways. It might be that the first description is talking about that first century time, when the attack on Jerusalem, and then the Romans and the persecution that was going to come there. It might be talking about that time, and when that battle was over and he lost, then he goes on to the next age, and he takes the offspring of the woman, the next generation of the people of God, and he tries to do something to them. So it could mean something like that. Or maybe it's just meaning that in every battle, every local battle, every instance of this tribulation between the people of God and the forces of Satan, that when he gets done with that one, he goes to another one. He may be doing all these at one time, but it's being pictured as, he hasn't given up. He's defeated 3 times already, but he's defeated. He hasn't given up yet. But as we see a little bit later, he's being constrained. He's being bound. Why does God, we'll close with this, why does God let evil keep going? Why did he let Satan get started in the first place?
The concept of choice is that important to him.
It's that important. Listen, if there is no evil, there is no good. We cannot be good. We cannot be morally good if we can't stand against evil, right? If we can't choose God over evil, we can't really be what we need to be in ourselves. I know that's way oversimplifying, and there's a lot of questions we could discuss, but I just want you to think about just what Chris was saying this morning. These battles, these trials, they're important for the people of God. Number one, we may be able to use them to redeem other people. to rescue others. But number two, we need strength. We need endurance to get through. We need to be able to, we take our little children and we put them to the test because they have to grow physically, mentally, all the other ways. We have to put them to the test. They can't sit there and vegetate. Physically, they'll be, they'll be abnormal. They won't be what they ought to be. Mentally, it has to be a challenge. And God puts us to the test. He puts us to the test. But it's really glorious. I won't let you go. If you don't turn your back on me, I'll keep you through it. The victory's won. The victory is yours. Just be faithful. Just be faithful. And he thinks that's good for us. Anything else this morning before we stop?
Along with what Pat said about they didn't have Bibles like we do today, I want to encourage us, don't get hung up on them hard questions that you keep asking. You need to, you may not understand.
It's good for you, Wayne.
Until you read on, and maybe it's self-explanatory.
Yeah, don't give up.
I'm sure you didn't come up with those questions by reading that one verse. Oh, you read
No,
it. Oh, yeah.
you're so right. I appreciate that. He stood on the sand of the sea. Some of this is in chapter 13 in some of your versions, but I think it really fits here. This dragon is making war on the sea, on the offspring of the woman, and he's standing on the sea. In chapter 13, we see why he's standing there. Okay, so we'll pick that up next week. Thank you all.